In just 4 minutes, one classified document destroyed Europe's most powerful alliance. I've covered 17 summits. I've witnessed diplomatic breakdowns, trade wars, alliance collapses, but what happened at 11:47 a.m. on June 12 at the G7 summit wasn't just political theater. It was systematic obliteration of Emmanuel Macron by a woman who had spent months building an airtight corruption case. Kemi Badenoch walked into conference room Alpha carrying a black briefcase. She looked like a prosecutor who had cornered a defendant she'd been hunting for years. What none of us knew was that briefcase contained evidence that would expose the most explosive financial scandal in EU-UK relations since Brexit. But she didn't reveal it immediately. The silence that followed was absolute, not diplomatic courtesy. This was the kind of quiet that comes when everyone knows they're about to witness history. At 11:46 a.m., Macron's chief diplomatic advisor received an urgent message on his secure phone. I watched his face drain of color as he whispered something panicked in French to the president. Macron's legendary confidence visibly shaken. His EU liaison was frantically scrolling through encrypted messages, looking terrified, like France's entire European strategy was about to explode. And then Kemi Badenoch opened her briefcase. "President Macron," she began, her voice cutting through the room with authority that silenced translators, "I want to discuss the European Fishing Rights Coordination Fund and some concerning financial arrangements." Standard diplomatic opening. Nothing unusual yet. Macron looked relieved, even amused. His team were preparing standard responses about EU fishing cooperation. But Badenoch's briefcase was positioned precisely, open to a tab marked with red classification tape. This wasn't improvised. This was orchestrated destruction. "Madam Prime Minister," Macron replied in his accented English, falling back on his usual diplomatic charm, "France remains committed to transparent cooperation in all matters of maritime resource management within established EU frameworks." Perfect diplomatic non-answer. But Badenoch wasn't interested in pleasantries. I could see her building toward something, like a prosecutor building toward crucial evidence that destroys the defendant's case. "Mr. President," she said, removing a document from her briefcase with theatrical precision, "are you familiar with a company called Maritime Holdings, incorporated in Luxembourg on February 3rd? The question hung in the air like diplomatic poison. Macron's expression didn't change immediately, but I watched his hands. They went completely still. When politicians' hands stop moving during international negotiations, it means their fight-or-flight response has activated. "Madam Prime Minister," Macron replied, his voice still controlled but lacking his usual confidence, "France engages with many maritime organizations as part of our commitment to European fishing coordination." Wrong answer. Catastrophically wrong. When asked about a specific Luxembourg shell company, generic answers about maritime organizations suggest you're hiding something. Badenoch pulled out a second document with EU classification markings clearly visible to cameras. "Mr. President," she continued, her voice gaining the momentum of a prosecutor who knows she's about to land the killing blow, "according to these financial records, obtained through intelligence cooperation with our Luxembourg allies, Maritime Holdings received 4.2 billion in EU fishing subsidies between 2019 and 2023. A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the international delegation. Observers. 4.2 billion NOLs wasn't just significant. It was more than most EU members' entire fishing budgets combined. But Badenoch wasn't finished building her case. "And Mr. President," she said, producing yet another document. "These same financial records show that 73% of those subsidies were redirected to French fishing conglomerates owned by companies linked to your political donors." The room went silent. Not diplomatic courtesy. This was international observers processing information that could topple governments and reshape European alliances. Macron's chief advisor leaned forward. Diplomatic composure shattered. His EU liaison stopped checking her tablet, staring at Badenoch with disaster-level shock. But what happened next was the moment that changed everything. Macron shot forward in his chair, his legendary cool completely evaporating. "Madam Prime Minister, these allegations are completely false and represent a serious breach of diplomatic protocol." "Mr. President," Badenoch interrupted, her voice cutting through his protest like a diplomatic blade. "Are you denying that you personally attended a private dinner in Monaco on August 15, 2022, where the Mediterranean Maritime Holdings arrangement was finalized?" Silence. Complete, absolute silence. For exactly 9 seconds. "I timed it," Macron said. Nothing. 9 seconds might not sound significant. But in high-stakes international diplomacy, 9 seconds of silence is equivalent to a full confession. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. The confident French president was gone, replaced by something I'd never heard before: panic with a diplomatic accent. I attend many dinners as part of France's diplomatic obligations. I cannot recall every specific business discussion or organization mentioned." Catastrophic response. When a president says, "I cannot recall," about 4.2 billion in fishing subsidies that benefited his donors, it doesn't sound like innocence. It sounds like criminal conspiracy. Badenoch opened her briefcase one final time and removed what would become the smoking gun that ended Macron's European leadership. "Mr. President," she said, her voice now carrying the absolute authority of someone who held complete power over her opponent's political survival, "perhaps this will refresh your memory." She placed a high-resolution photograph on the conference table, positioning it so that diplomatic cameras could capture every detail. The image showed Macron shaking hands with Gerard Rousseau, CEO of Mediterranean Maritime Holdings, at what was clearly an intimate dinner setting with expensive wine and French cuisine visible in the background. This photograph was taken at Le Louis Vuitton in Monaco on August 15, 2022, the same evening that 84.7 million beyonds in fishing subsidies were approved for companies owned by Mr. Rousseau's network. The timing was devastating. Same day, same location, same players. This wasn't coincidence. This was documented corruption at the highest levels of European governance. I watched Macron's face drain of color in real time. Actually watched it happen from his normal complexion to pale white in about 8 seconds. His hands, which had been still, were now visibly trembling. Not slight nervousness. Actual shaking that was clearly visible to everyone in the room. In the monitoring room, his diplomatic team was no longer watching the meeting. They were typing frantically on secure phones, probably sending emergency damage control instructions to every French embassy and EU institution in the world. But Badenoch wasn't finished destroying him. "Mr. President," she continued, producing another document marked with French government seals, "I also have here a copy of the handwritten note you sent to EU Commissioner Thierry Breton, specifically requesting expedited approval for Mediterranean Maritime Holdings subsidy applications." At 11:51 a.m., exactly 4 minutes after she'd begun speaking, Emmanuel Macron experienced complete diplomatic breakdown. His voice was barely audible through translation headsets. "Madam Prime Minister, these documents, without proper context, fishing industry requires complex coordination." He stopped mid-sentence. 17 seconds of silence. I've never seen a head of state unable to complete a sentence during bilateral negotiations. The silence was broken by Badenoch's calm, measured response. "Mr. President, I'm not questioning France's fishing industry coordination. I'm questioning $4.2 billion in EU subsidies that were diverted to your political donors through shell companies, while British fishing communities received nothing." The accusation hung in the air like diplomatic dynamite. This wasn't just about fishing quotas anymore. This was about systematic theft of EU resources by one of its most powerful member states, orchestrated by its president for personal political gain. Macron's diplomatic advisor was now whispering urgently in French, But even he seemed to recognize that standard diplomatic damage control was inadequate for accusations of this magnitude. Furthermore, Badenoch continued, opening her final folder, our intelligence services have identified at least 12 other EU subsidy programs where similar arrangements benefited French companies with direct ties to your election campaigns. The expansion from one scandal to systematic corruption across 12 programs demonstrated that this wasn't isolated misconduct. This was a criminal enterprise operating at the highest levels of European governance. At 11:52 a.m., Macron made the decision that effectively ended France's European leadership aspirations. We will need to review these documents with our legal teams and provide a comprehensive response through appropriate diplomatic channels. Wrong answer. Fatally wrong. When you're accused of stealing $4.2 billion EU fishing subsidies, you don't promise to review documents. You categorically deny the allegations or admit guilt. Promising legal review sounds like you're buying time to craft defense, which suggests there's something criminal to defend. The room erupted in the diplomatic equivalent of chaos. EU observers were frantically taking notes. German Chancellor Scholz, who had been scheduled to meet with Macron immediately after this bilateral, was reportedly canceling the meeting via his chief of staff. Italian Prime Minister Meloni's delegation was already discussing emergency EU Council sessions. In the international press room, reporters were typing so fast, their keyboards sounded like machine guns. The BBC's diplomatic correspondent was speaking urgently into her microphone. This could be the end of Macron's European project. We're witnessing the collapse of Franco-British relations in real time. As the meeting concluded, I overheard urgent conversations in multiple languages, confirming everyone's thoughts. C'est fini. It's vorbei. It's over. The $4.2 billion fishing rights scandal that Badenoch had just exposed wasn't just about maritime policy or post-Brexit arrangements. It was about a European leader who had systematically stolen EU resources to enrich his political donors while British fishing communities suffered under punitive quotas. By 12:30 p.m., Macron fishing scandal was trending in 17 languages. By 1:15 p.m., the EU's anti-fraud office confirmed investigation. By 2:30 p.m., 5 member states called for emergency council meetings. Every major European news channel ran wall-to-wall Fishgate coverage, connecting France's president to systematic theft of EU fishing subsidies. And it all started with one black briefcase carried by a woman who had spent months building an unbreakable case against the self-proclaimed leader of European integration. What I witnessed that afternoon wasn't just diplomatic confrontation, it was the precise moment when evidence obliterated alliance, when documentation defeated denial, and when one leader's meticulous preparation systematically destroyed another leader's entire European legacy. The G7 summit continued for 2 more days. But everyone knew the real story had already been written. France's influence in European fishing policy was finished. Macron's credibility on EU resource management was destroyed. The Franco-British relationship had shifted permanently in Britain's favor. Sometimes diplomatic justice takes years through international courts and EU investigations. Sometimes it takes 4 minutes in a Bavarian conference room. On June 12th, I watched Kemi Badenoch prove that in international relations, like in criminal law, documented evidence always defeats diplomatic immunity in the end. The only question was how much damage France's corruption would do to European unity before the truth finished spreading. If this breakdown of international accountability restored your faith in diplomatic transparency, don't just watch, like, share, and subscribe to our channel where corruption gets exposed and lies get prosecuted, no matter which flag they hide behind. Hit the bell. The next scandal might involve your nation's representative. What would you do if you discovered your ally had been stealing billions in international subsidies? Drop a comment below. This analysis is based on diplomatic proceedings and international financial documentation. All dialogue and specific details are dramatized for educational and commentary purposes.